The crucible began at dawn on the fourth day, and the planets seemed to wake up angry. 3 trial zones activated simultaneously across Oneth 4, a frozen mountain range in the northern hemisphere where temperatures dropped low enough to crack metal. A dense fungal jungle in the equatorial belt where the air itself was toxic, and a shattered urban wasteland on the western continent that looked like a city that had died screaming. Each species had to split its team into 3 groups and send them into all 3 environments at the same time. There was no choosing which zone to enter. There was no avoiding the ones that did not suit your biology. You sent your people in, and you hoped they came back. Vreth monitored everything from the orbital observation deck, where dozens of screens showed live drone feeds from every zone. Around him, military analysts from every species sat at their stations, murmuring observations into recording devices and shaking their heads at the sheer brutality of the trial design. The Crucible organizers did not believe in gentle introductions. In the frozen mountains, the Drathan war clans were magnificent. Their massive reptilian bodies powered through waist-deep snow and sub-zero winds as if it were a mild inconvenience. They smashed through obstacles with raw physical force, tore apart simulated enemy positions with their bare claws, and completed their first objective before any other team had even reached theirs. The Drathan analysts on the observation deck rumbled with satisfaction. This was what they were built for. The Valori performed just as well in the urban wasteland. Their cybernetically enhanced soldiers cleared the ruined city with cold, mechanical efficiency. Every movement was calculated. Every shot was precise. They moved through the broken streets like a single machine with 30 parts, each one knowing exactly where to be and what to do at every moment. A Valori officer near Vreth watched the feed with the quiet pride of someone watching a perfectly tuned engine run. The humans, by contrast, seemed to be struggling. In the fungal jungle, a squad of 10 led by Sergeant Chris Dunn ran straight into trouble within the first 2 hours. The jungle was filled with toxic spore clouds, massive drifting walls of pale yellow particles that could shut down respiratory systems in minutes. The Nyx collective team had simply adapted, their shapeshifter biology growing internal filters within seconds. The Shale team had brought specialized breathing equipment designed for exactly this kind of environment. The humans had standard-issue field masks, and the spore density was far beyond what those masks could handle. Vreth watched the drone feed and expected to see the human squad pull back. Any rational commander would retreat, reassess, and find another route. Chris Dunn did not retreat. He pulled his team into a shallow cave, looked around at the rock formations, and started talking. Vreth could not hear the words, but he could see the squad listening intently. Within 10 minutes, they were tearing strips from their own uniforms, crushing soft mineral deposits from the cave walls into fine powder, and packing the mixture into layered filters that they strapped over their existing masks. It was crude. It looked ridiculous. A Nyx analyst on the deck laughed out loud at the sight of human soldiers with chunks of rock and torn fabric tied to their faces. But Chris led his squad back into the spore clouds, and the makeshift filters held. They were not perfect. 2 soldiers coughed badly, and one had to pause every few minutes to clear his breathing. But they worked well enough. The humans pushed through the spore zone and reached their objective, while the Nyx team, despite their biological advantage, was still stalled 2 kilometers back, arguing about the optimal path forward. In the frozen mountains, a 5-person human fire team under Corporal Megan Holt faced a different kind of problem. Their objective required them to cross a wide valley, but an ambush scenario activated just as they entered the open ground. Simulated enemies appeared on the ridgelines, 4 times the number of defenders as attackers. It was designed to test how teams handled overwhelming odds in exposed terrain. The Drathan solution was simple: charge through and absorb the hits. Their thick hides and raw aggression made it possible, if costly. The Valori solution was precise suppressive fire and rapid mechanical movement. Both approaches worked, but both took casualties. Megan Holt looked at the valley, looked at the ridgelines, and then turned her team around. She led them into a narrow ice canyon that ran parallel to the valley, a route that the scenario designers had included as terrain decoration, not as a viable path. The canyon was tight, unstable, and filled with hanging ice formations that could collapse at any moment. Megan studied the ice walls for about 30 seconds, then ordered her team to fire their sidearms at 3 specific points near the canyon entrance. The ice cracked and fell, sealing the entrance behind them and cutting off any pursuit. On the observation deck, a shale analyst frowned and said, "They have trapped themselves." But Megan had not trapped herself. She led her team through the canyon, emerged on the far side of the valley behind the simulated enemy positions, and hit them from the rear. The ambush force, designed to face enemies coming from the front, was eliminated in minutes. Megan's team took 0 casualties. The shale analyst stared at his screen for a long time and said nothing. In the urban wasteland, Lieutenant Katie Marsh faced the hardest test of all. Her squad walked into an objective that was clearly designed to be unwinnable. A civilian rescue scenario under heavy fire with a countdown timer. Simulated civilians were trapped in 3 separate buildings across a wide plaza, and simulated enemies held every angle. The math did not work. There were not enough soldiers to fight and rescue at the same time, and the timer was too short to do them in sequence. Every other species that attempted this scenario made a choice: fight the enemies and abandon the civilians, or attempt the rescue and accept heavy combat losses. The Drathan ignored the civilians entirely. The Valori calculated that the civilians were not worth the tactical cost and moved on. Even the shale team, with all their planning ability, could not find a solution that saved everyone. Katie Marsh refused to choose. She split her squad of 8 into 3 pairs and assigned each pair a building. She gave them exactly 90 seconds per building. Get in, grab the civilians, get out, pass them to the next pair at a relay point behind cover. While the pairs ran the rescue relay, Katie and one volunteer, a young soldier named Danny Voss, stepped into the middle of the plaza in full view of every simulated enemy and opened fire. They drew every shot. Every single simulated enemy in the scenario focused on the 2 exposed humans standing in the open. Katie and Danny moved constantly, ducking behind rubble, rolling between cover points, firing just enough to keep attention on themselves. Danny took 2 simulated hits and kept moving. Katie took 1 and did not even flinch. The rescue pairs completed their runs. Every simulated civilian was extracted. The timer hit 0, with 4 seconds to spare. On the observation deck, Vreth realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out slowly and looked around the room. The Drathan analysts were quiet. The Valori officer who had called the humans a novelty entry was staring at his screen with an expression Vreth had never seen on a Valori face: uncertainty. When the first trial phase ended, the scores were tallied. The Drathan war clans ranked first, their raw physical dominance earning them top marks in the mountain zone. The Valori Empire ranked second, their precision and technology carrying them through the urban trials. The humans ranked third. Third place should not have been remarkable, but every analyst on that deck knew that the humans had achieved it without superior bodies, without cybernetic enhancements, without biological adaptation, and without any equipment that was not standard issue. They had done it with torn uniforms, crushed rocks, ice physics, and 2 soldiers willing to stand in the open and get shot so that simulated strangers could live. That night, long after most observers had retired, Vreth sat alone on the observation deck and reviewed the footage. He watched Chris Dunn sitting with his squad after the jungle trial, laughing about the ridiculous filters they had built, slapping a coughing soldier on the back, and telling him he looked great. He watched Megan Holt in the barracks, dealing cards to her fire team and losing badly, which seemed to make her happier than winning had. He watched Katie Marsh alone in a planning room at 2 in the morning, studying maps of the next trial zone, making notes in a small notebook, her face lit by the glow of a single screen. And Vreth understood something that the scoreboard did not capture. The other species were competing. They were performing at their peak, executing their training, doing exactly what they were designed to do. The humans were learning. Every trial, every failure, every improvised solution was making them sharper, faster, more dangerous. They were not just surviving the crucible. They were adapting to it in real time, soaking up information like dry ground soaking up rain. Vreth closed his datapad and sat in the dark for a long time. The crucible was far from over, and he had the growing feeling that what he had seen today was just the beginning. The second phase of the crucible changed everything. The separate trial zones were shut down, and every remaining team was dropped into a single massive operational area, a scarred volcanic plateau in the southern hemisphere of Oneth 4. The terrain was brutal. Rivers of cooling lava cut across blackened rock fields. Collapsed ruins dotted the landscape, remnants of structures built and destroyed by previous crucibles. Underground tunnel networks honeycombed the ground beneath, some stable and some ready to collapse at the slightest vibration. The air smelled like sulfur and hot metal, and the sky was a permanent haze of ash and volcanic gas that made long-range visibility almost impossible. The rules of the second phase were more complex than the first. Each species had to capture and hold 3 strategic points scattered across the plateau, while simultaneously defending a designated home base. Secondary objectives changed every 6 hours, forcing teams to constantly shift their plans. Alliances between species were permitted. Betrayal carried no penalty. The message was clear. The galaxy did not care about fairness. It cared about results. The alliances formed fast. The Valerie Empire and the Nyx Collective announced a partnership within the first hour, combining cybernetic precision with biological adaptability into a force that looked almost unbeatable on paper. The Drathan war clans, too proud to ally with anyone, declared they would fight alone and dared anyone to challenge them. The Shale Dominion, true to form, offered logistical support to the Valerie Nyx alliance in exchange for protection, a safe, calculated move that surprised nobody. What Commander Nate Grady did surprised everybody. Instead of approaching one of the powerful factions, Nate walked across the staging area to the smallest and weakest team still in the competition, the Pelori. They were a timid, avian species with hollow bones, thin membrane wings, and soft feathered bodies that looked like they would break in a strong wind. The Pelori had entered the Crucible for the 12th time and had never finished higher than last place. Most species treated them as background noise. Some did not even bother to learn their names. Nate Grady learned their names. He sat down with the Pelori commander, a nervous bird-like figure named Kale, and spoke with him for nearly an hour. Vreth watched from across the staging area, baffled. When Nate stood up and shook Kale's wing hand, the deal was done. The humans and the Pelori were allies. The reaction on the observation deck was immediate and dismissive. A Drathan analyst barked a laugh. A Valori strategist called it a sentimental waste of resources. Even Vreth's Shale colleagues shook their heads. The Pelori brought nothing useful to a fight. They were small, fragile, and had no combat training worth mentioning. Allying with them was like strapping a weight to your ankle before a race. But Nate Grady had seen something that no one else had bothered to look for. The Pelori could fly. Their hollow bones and membrane wings allowed them to glide silently at high altitudes, riding thermal currents from the volcanic vents without making a sound. And their eyes were extraordinary, evolved over millions of years on a world of dense forests. Pelori vision could detect heat signatures through smoke, ash, and darkness, at distances that would blind most sensor equipment. In a volcanic landscape where the air was thick with haze and visibility was terrible for everyone, the Pelori were the perfect scouts. Within the first day, the advantage became obvious. While the Valori-Nix alliance relied on electronic sensors that struggled with the volcanic interference, and the Draythan relied on brute force patrols that left gaps in their coverage, the humans had living eyes in the sky that saw everything and told them everything. Pelori scouts drifted silently above the plateau, invisible against the ash-gray sky, and reported every enemy movement back to the human command post in real time. Nate Grady used that information like a surgeon uses a scalpel. He did not throw his forces at the enemy. He did not try to match the Draythan in strength or the Valori in technology. Instead, he played a different game entirely. The humans moved like ghosts across the volcanic terrain, appearing where they were not expected, striking fast, and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Sergeant Chris Dunn led the first major operation, a nighttime raid on a Valori supply cache that was hidden in a tunnel complex 3 kilometers behind enemy lines. A Pelori scout had spotted the cache from the air, mapping every guard position and patrol route. Chris took 6 soldiers into the tunnels, moving in complete darkness, using nothing but touch signals and memorized layouts. They reached the cache, took everything they could carry, sabotaged the rest, and slipped out the same way they had come in. The Valori did not discover the theft until the next morning, when they sent a resupply team and found empty containers and melted equipment. The Valori admiral was furious. He doubled his guard patrols and deployed sensor nets around every remaining supply point. The Pelori scouts found the gaps, and the humans slipped through them. But the real test came on the 5th day, when the Draythan war clans finally turned their attention to the humans. The Draythan had been watching. They had crushed 2 secondary objectives with overwhelming force and pushed the Nix collective out of an entire sector of the plateau. Now they wanted the human home base, partly for strategic value, partly because the Draythan warlord, a towering warrior named Grath, had taken the humans' quiet confidence as a personal insult. Grath assembled his full remaining force of 32 warriors and launched a direct assault at midday, roaring across the volcanic flats in a charge that shook the ground. Nate Grady had been expecting this for 2 days. Every Pelori scout report, every pattern of Draythan movement, every supply line shift had pointed to this moment. And Nate had prepared. The human base looked weak from the outside. It was built around a cluster of half-collapsed ruins with low walls and obvious gaps in the perimeter. Any military analyst would have called it a poor defensive position. But Corporal Megan Holt had spent those 2 days turning every weakness into a weapon. The low walls hid reinforced firing positions. The gaps in the perimeter were kill zones covered by overlapping fields of fire. The ground in front of the base was seeded with noise traps and tripwires that would slow any charge and break up formations. The ruins themselves were connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to move unseen from one position to another. The Draythan hit the perimeter like a tidal wave. 32 warriors, each one capable of tearing a human apart with their bare hands, crashed against the human defenses with all the fury their species was famous for. And the humans held. Megan Holt commanded the defense from the center of the base, her voice calm and steady over the comm channel. She shifted defenders from position to position as the Draythan probed for weaknesses. When the Draythan smashed through a section of wall on the east side, a fire team was already waiting in the tunnel behind it, and drove them back with concentrated fire. When Grath himself led a charge at the north wall, Megan pulled 2 soldiers from the quiet south sector and had them flanking the Draythan warlord before he even reached the barrier. The battle lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of constant pressure from the most physically powerful species in the galaxy. 9 hours of the humans bending, but never breaking, giving ground in one place, only to take it back in another, refusing to crack, no matter how hard the Drathan pushed. During the 6th hour, a young private named Danny Voss got separated from his squad when a section of tunnel collapsed behind him. He found himself alone, on the wrong side of the perimeter, surrounded by Drathan warriors, regrouping for another push. Danny had two choices: hide and wait for rescue, or do something stupid. Danny chose stupid. He opened his comm channel to the widest broadcast setting, which meant every team in the Crucible could hear him, and he started talking. He described every Drathan position he could see. He counted their numbers, noted their formations, reported which direction they were massing for the next attack. He was loud, clear, and completely exposed. The Drathan realized what he was doing and came for him. Danny ran, still broadcasting, dodging between rocks and ruins, while calling out enemy movements in a steady voice that never once cracked with fear. His squad used the information to anticipate the next Drathan assault and set up a perfect counter-ambush. Danny took 3 simulated hits before he was officially eliminated, but he kept broadcasting until the system shut him down. When the elimination alert sounded, Danny Voss sat down on a rock, breathing hard, covered in simulated wound markers, and grinned. On the observation deck, Vreth watched the battle end as the Drathan finally pulled back, battered and exhausted. He saw Grath, the Drathan warlord, standing at the edge of the human perimeter, staring at the base he had failed to take. Then Grath did something that no one on the observation deck had ever seen a Drathan warrior do. He raised his fist to his chest, the Drathan salute of respect for a worthy enemy, and held it there for a long moment before turning and walking away. Meanwhile, on the other side of the plateau, Katie Marsh had been busy. While the Drathan assault drew every eye in the galaxy, Katie had taken a small team on a looping route through underground tunnels and captured 2 strategic points that the Valori-Nyx alliance had left underdefended. It was a gamble that relied on the Drathan attack keeping everyone distracted, and it worked perfectly. A Valori admiral would later review the operation and call it either genius or insanity. Katie Marsh would later say it was a little bit of both. When the second phase scores were tallied, the humans were in first place. The observation deck fell silent. Vreth looked at the scoreboard, then looked at the faces around him. Drathan warriors who had never been outfought, Valori officers who had never been outthought, Nyx biologists who had never been outadapted. Every single one of them was staring at the same name at the top of the rankings, and every single one of them was trying to understand how it had gotten there. Vreth felt the first tremor of something deep and certain move through him, like the first crack in a dam that was about to break. He did not have the words for it yet, but he was beginning to understand. The third and final phase of the Crucible was designed to destroy people. The rules were simple. Every remaining team would stay in the operational zone for 72 continuous hours. There would be no resupply drops, no reinforcement, no rotation of personnel, and no mercy. Environmental hazards would escalate throughout. Simulated orbital bombardment, seismic instability, toxic gas vents, and randomly shifting terrain that could turn solid ground into a collapsing sinkhole without warning. At the 60-hour mark, all communications would be cut. The final 12 hours would be fought in total radio silence. The last team standing with its home base intact would win the Crucible. It was not a competition anymore. It was a test of how much a species could endure before it broke. The first 24 hours unfolded like a slow collapse. The alliance between the Valori Empire and the Nyx Collective, which had looked so powerful on paper, cracked apart under the pressure of sustained operations. The Nyx Collective had entered the Crucible to demonstrate their biological superiority, not to bleed for the Valori's strategic ambitions. When a Valori commander ordered a Nyx squad to hold an exposed position that would cost them dearly, the Nyx refused. Within hours, the alliance was dead, and the Nyx collective withdrew entirely from the competition, their shapeshifter biology carrying them away into the volcanic haze like ghosts. The Drathan war clans, still stinging from their failed assault on the human base, turned their frustration on the easiest target they could find. They hit the Shale Dominion with everything they had. The Shale were thinkers, not fighters, and their defenses collapsed in under 3 hours. Vreth watched his own team's elimination on the screen with a strange sense of detachment. He should have been upset. He should have been thinking about the Shale report he would have to write, the political fallout, the embarrassment. But all he could think about was the humans. By the 30-hour mark, only 3 teams remained: the Valori Empire, the Drathan war clans, and the humans with their Pelori allies. The volcanic plateau had become a triangle of exhausted forces, each one watching the others, waiting for someone to make the first mistake. At the 40-hour mark, the cracks began to show in everyone. The Valori soldiers were impressive machines, but machines needed maintenance. Their cybernetic implants ran on internal power reserves that were designed for short, intense engagements, not multi-day endurance operations. The implants began to overheat. Processing speeds dropped. Reflexes that had been lightning fast in the first phase became merely average. 2 Valori soldiers suffered system crashes, their cybernetics shutting down entirely, leaving them temporarily paralyzed until their organic nervous systems could compensate. The Valori admiral watched from the observation deck with a tight jaw and said nothing. The Drathan were suffering in a different way. Their massive bodies were powerful, but power came with a cost. Drathan metabolism burned through energy reserves at a rate that no amount of rationing could sustain over 3 days. Their warriors were slowing down. Movements that had been explosive and terrifying in the first phase were now heavy and labored. Grath, the Drathan warlord, was still on his feet through sheer willpower, but even he looked diminished, like a fire burning down to coals. The humans were hurting too, and they did not try to hide it. Vreth watched the drone feeds and saw the toll plainly. Soldiers with dark circles under their eyes, hands that trembled slightly when reloading weapons, voices that were hoarse from days of breathing volcanic air. They were running low on food, low on water, and low on medical supplies. Their Pelori allies were in even worse shape. The fragile avian scouts had pushed themselves far beyond their natural limits, and several had grounded themselves with exhaustion, their wings too heavy to lift. But something held the humans together, and Vreth could see it even through the grainy drone footage. It was something he had no word for in the Shale language. He watched Commander Nate Grady move through his base during a brief lull in the fighting. Nate was as tired as anyone. His eyes were bloodshot, and his movements were slower than they had been. And there was a heaviness in his shoulders that had not been there at the start. But he did not go to his command post. He did not review tactical displays or check supply inventories. Instead, he walked to where his people were. He sat down next to a soldier named Leah Grant, who had taken a bad simulated hit to her leg and was sitting against a wall with her eyes closed. Nate said something to her that the drone microphones did not pick up. Leah opened her eyes, looked at him, and laughed. A real laugh, tired and rough, but genuine. Nate patted her shoulder and moved on. He found Chris Dunn checking ammunition counts and helped him stack supply crates for a few minutes, talking quietly the whole time. He stopped by the Pelori scouts who had grounded themselves and shared his last ration bar with them, breaking it into pieces with his hands and passing them out. The Pelori commander, Kale, looked at the food and then looked at Nate with an expression that Vreth, even with his limited understanding of Pelori biology, recognized as disbelief. No one had ever shared their last meal with a Pelori before. Then Nate found Megan Holt, who was still at her post on the north wall, where she had been for over 30 hours without sleep. Her eyes were glassy, and her hands were wrapped around her weapon with the kind of grip that comes from forgetting how to let go. Nate stood beside her and said simply, "I am proud of you, Megan." She nodded once, blinked hard, and went back to watching her sector. Vreth sat on the observation deck and felt something shift inside his chest. He was watching a species that should have been broken by now. Every metric said they should be finished. They had no biological advantage. They had no technological edge. They had nothing left in their supply stores. By every rational calculation, the humans should have surrendered 12 hours ago. But they had something the calculations could not measure. They had each other. Not by programming, not by genetics, not by command hierarchy, or cybernetic linking, or hive mind consensus. Every single human on that volcanic plateau had chosen to be there, chosen to stand beside the person next to them, and that choice, remade every hour, every minute, through exhaustion and pain and fear, was holding them together like gravity holds stars. The communications blackout hit at the 60-hour mark, and the final 12 hours began. Without comms, the Valori crumbled first. Their entire command structure relied on real-time data sharing between network soldiers and central command processors. Without that network, individual Valori soldiers became isolated and uncertain. Their officers, trained to coordinate through digital channels, could not adapt fast enough to voice commands and hand signals. Defensive positions that should have held fell apart within the first hour of silence. The Drathan held together better. Their command structure was simple and based on following the strongest warrior, and Grath's physical presence kept his troops in line. But without communication, the Drathan began making mistakes. Squads moved to positions that were already abandoned. Counterattacks hit empty ground. Coordination dissolved into a collection of angry individuals fighting alone. The humans adapted as if they had been born for silence. Each squad leader, Chris, Megan, Katie, already understood the full plan and their role within it. Nate had briefed them so thoroughly over the past 2 days that they could have executed the defense in their sleep. They did not need real-time orders. They trusted each other to do their jobs, and that trust was its own communication. When a sudden seismic event ripped open the ground and destroyed a key section of the defensive wall on the eastern side of the base, a medic named Brooke Tanner was the first to respond. Brooke was not a combat soldier. She was not an engineer. She was a field medic who had spent the past 3 days patching up wounded soldiers with dwindling supplies. But she saw the wall fall, saw the gap in the defense, and acted. She gathered every walking wounded and non-combat personnel she could find and organized them into a repair crew. They hauled rubble, stacked debris, and built a makeshift barricade in under 20 minutes. No one told Brooke to do it. She saw a problem, and she fixed it, because that was what humans did. The final hours became the stuff of legend. The Drathan, with nothing left to lose, launched one last massive assault against the human position. Grath led the charge personally, his massive body plowing through the ash and smoke like a living siege engine. At the same time, the remaining Valori forces, desperate and disorganized but still dangerous, attempted a flanking approach from the south. The humans were hit from 2 sides by 2 of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and so exhausted that some of them could barely stand. Nate Grady stood in the center of his base, looked at the men and women around him, human and Pelori alike, and said 5 words that Vreth would remember for the rest of his life. That is all. And they held. Katie Marsh ran the defensive rotation with a precision that bordered on supernatural. She tracked every soldier's position, every threat vector, every ammunition count in her head, and she rotated defenders so efficiently that every person got exactly 90 seconds of rest between engagements. It was not enough rest. It was not even close. But it kept them functional, kept them fighting, kept them alive. Chris Dunn did not just defend. He counterattacked. When the Valori flanking force pushed through the southern perimeter, Chris took 8 soldiers, the last reserve the humans had, and drove them back in a charge so ferocious and so unexpected that the Valori broke and scattered. A Valori officer later said it was like being hit by a storm that had decided to take the fight personally. Megan Holt held the north wall. She had been awake for over 60 hours. She had a simulated shrapnel wound on her left arm that had been roughly bandaged and was leaking red marker fluid down her sleeve. A medic tried to pull her off the line for treatment. Megan looked at the medic, looked at the Drathan warriors charging her wall, and said no. She stayed, she fought, she held that wall until the final horn sounded, and the crucible was over. The horn echoed across the volcanic plateau like the voice of a god, and everything stopped. The Drathan assault froze mid-stride. The Valori survivors lowered their weapons. The ash continued to fall from the sky like gray snow, covering everything in a fine layer of silence. The humans were the last team standing, with their home base intact. For a moment, no one moved. Then the observation deck erupted. Species that had mocked the humans 12 days ago were on their feet. Analysts who had written them off were shouting. Journalists were transmitting footage to 100 worlds simultaneously. On the field, Grath, the Drathan warlord, walked slowly across the scorched ground to where Nate Grady stood. Grath was huge, towering over the human commander by nearly 3 feet. He looked down at Nate with eyes that had seen 1,000 battles and had never once shown respect to a non-Drathan warrior. Grath extended his massive clawed hand. Nate took it without hesitation. Behind them, the Pelori scouts were weeping, small, fragile, dismissed by every species in the galaxy. They had been treated as equals by the humans, from the first moment to the last. Not once had Nate used them as expendable shields. Not once had a human soldier treated them as lesser. The Pelori commander, Kale, stood among his scouts with tears running down his feathered face, and his thin wings trembling, overwhelmed by something he had never experienced before. The feeling of being truly valued by someone stronger. Vreth sat in his chair on the observation deck, his hands shaking, his compound eyes wet in a way they had never been before. And he finally understood. He finally understood why the galaxy spoke the name of humanity the way it did. It was not because they were strong. It was not because they were clever. It was not because they won. It was because of the way they won, and the way they treated everyone around them while doing it. The aftermath of the Crucible moved through the galaxy like a shockwave. Within hours of the final horn, footage of the human victory was being broadcast on news networks across 100 worlds. Billions of beings who had never seen a human in person watched Commander Nate Grady shake the hand of a Drathan warlord on a scorched volcanic field. They watched Corporal Megan Holt refuse to leave her wall with blood running down her arm. They watched a 19-year-old private named Danny Voss broadcast enemy positions from behind enemy lines with a grin on his face. They watched a medic named Brooke Tanner organize a wall repair with nothing but rubble and the determination of someone who refused to let a problem go unsolved. The footage played on loop in trade stations and diplomatic halls. It filled the screens in military academies and university lecture rooms. It was discussed in council chambers and argued about in cantinas and whispered about in the quiet corridors of power where the real decisions of galactic politics were made. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had an analysis. The Valori military published a 300-page tactical study of human performance within a week, dissecting every move, every decision, every improvised solution. The Drathan war clans quietly restructured their training program for the first time in 600 years. The Nix Collective, who had withdrawn from the Crucible early, sent a formal diplomatic request to study human endurance biology. Even the Shale Dominion's military council held an emergency session to discuss what they called the human variable. Vreth read all of it. He watched every analysis, attended every briefing, downloaded every report. And none of it captured what he had actually seen. The reports talked about tactics. They talked about improvisation. They talked about adaptability and risk tolerance and unconventional thinking. All of that was true, and all of it missed the point. It was like describing a sunrise by listing the wavelengths of light involved. Technically accurate, but completely empty of meaning. On the morning of the departure day, Vreth sent a message to the human delegation requesting a private meeting with Commander Nate Grady. He did not expect a response. The humans had been flooded with interview requests and diplomatic invitations since the Crucible ended, and Vreth was just a mid-ranking Shael observer with no particular importance. He sent the message anyway, and went back to packing his belongings. The response came 20 minutes later. Nate Grady would meet him at the orbital station's observation lounge at noon. Vreth arrived early and stood at the wide viewport, looking down at Oneth 4. The planet looked peaceful from up here. Just a brown and gray ball hanging in space, its volcanic scars invisible from orbit. It was hard to believe that 12 days of the most intense military competition in the galaxy had just taken place on its surface. It was harder to believe what he had witnessed there. Nate Grady arrived exactly on time, which Vreth would later learn was unusual for him. He was wearing a clean version of the same simple dark gray uniform his team had worn throughout the Crucible. No medals, no rank insignia on display, no ceremonial additions. He looked like a man who had just come from a long walk, rather than a man who had just won the most prestigious military competition in known space. He smiled when he saw Vreth, and extended his hand. Vreth took it carefully. Shale hands were not designed for gripping, and felt the warmth of human skin against his own cool chitin. Counselor Domai, I read your observation reports during the trials. You were one of the few who actually paid attention to what was happening, instead of what they expected to happen. I appreciated that. Vreth was caught off guard. He had not expected the human commander to have read neutral observer reports. He gathered himself and decided to be direct. In 40 years of diplomacy, Vreth had learned that some questions were too important for careful wording. Commander Grady, Vreth said, I have spent the last 12 days watching your species, and I have a question that no tactical analysis has been able to answer. Your species is younger than every other civilization that competed. Your soldiers are physically weaker than the Drathan, less technologically augmented than the Valori, less biologically adaptable than the Nix. You brought standard equipment, no special advantages, and a team that looked, to most observers, like they were not even taking the competition seriously. And yet you won. I need to understand how. Nate looked at Vreth for a long moment. Then he turned to the viewport and looked down at the planet below. The faint smile on his face shifted into something quieter, something deeper. You want to know our secret, Nate said. Yes. Nate leaned against the viewport frame and crossed his arms. He was quiet for a while, and Vreth had the sense that this was not a man searching for words, but a man deciding how much of himself to reveal. There is no secret, Nate said finally. That is the part nobody believes. We do not have a trick. We do not have a hidden advantage. Every single thing you saw down there, the improvising, the refusing to quit, the holding the line when the math said we should have broken, all of that comes from one thing. My people would rather die than let the person next to them down. That is not something you can train into someone. It is not something you can engineer, or breed, or install with cybernetics. It is something each of them chose, and they choose it again every single day. Vreth pressed further. He wanted specifics. He wanted to understand the individual threads that wove together into the thing he had witnessed. Nate obliged. He talked about Katie Marsh, who had grown up in a small town in Oklahoma, where her father was a volunteer firefighter, and her mother ran the local emergency shelter during storms. Katie had joined the service because she wanted to protect people she had never met, and she had never once questioned that decision, even when it cost her sleep and comfort and the kind of life most people took for granted. He talked about Chris Dunn, who had been a firefighter in Boston before joining the military. Chris carried the same instinct into every operation, the instinct to run toward danger instead of away from it. Not because he was brave in the way most species understood bravery, but because he could not stand the thought of someone being in trouble while he did nothing. He talked about Danny Voss, who was 19 years old and had volunteered for the Crucible selection process 3 times before being accepted. Danny had no special skills, no exceptional scores, no remarkable physical abilities. What he had was a belief, deep and unshakable, that he was part of something bigger than himself. And that belief made him willing to stand in the open and broadcast enemy positions while the galaxy watched. He talked about Megan Holt, who held walls she had no business holding, because the people behind that wall were depending on her. He talked about Brooke Tanner, who saw a broken wall and fixed it without being asked, because that was simply what needed to be done. He talked about Leah Grant, who laughed at a joke while sitting in simulated pain, because laughter was how humans told each other they were still in the fight. "We are not special because we are strong," Nate said. "We are not special because we are smart. We are special because we produce people who run toward the fire. People who build bonds with strangers and call them family. People who refuse to quit, even when quitting is the only rational option. We have been doing this since before we left our homeworld. We did it when our cities burned, and when our nations fell, and when our planet nearly killed us a dozen times over. We just kept getting back up and reaching for each other. That is all we know how to do." Nate uncrossed his arms and looked at Vreth directly. His eyes were calm and clear, the eyes of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. "That is how we won, Counselor. Not because we are the best, but because we would rather break than let go of each other. And it turns out that is a very hard thing to beat." They stood together in silence for a while, looking down at the planet where it had all happened. Then Nate shook Vreth's hand once more, smiled, and left to rejoin his team. Vreth returned to his quarters and sat down at his desk. His official report for the Shiel Dominion was due before departure. He had been putting it off, not because he did not have enough to say, but because he had too much and did not know how to fit it into the formal, dispassionate language that Shiel reports required. The tactical analysis was straightforward. He described the human strategies, their improvisation, their use of the Pelori Alliance, their defensive operations, their endurance in the final phase. He documented everything with the careful precision his superiors expected. It took him several hours and filled dozens of pages, and when he finished, it was a fine report. Any military council in the galaxy would find it thorough and informative. But it was not enough. It did not capture the truth. Vreth scrolled to the final section of the report. Personal assessment. This section was optional. Most Shiel observers left it blank, or filled it with a few lines of detached commentary. Vreth had left it blank for 40 years. He placed his clawed fingers on the input pad, and paused. He thought about Megan Holt, bleeding and exhausted, refusing to leave a wall, because the people behind it needed her. He thought about Brooke Tanner, a medic with no engineering training, building a barricade because it needed to be built. He thought about Nate Grady breaking his last ration bar into pieces and sharing it with Pelori scouts who had never been valued by anyone. He thought about Danny Voss, 19 years old and grinning, choosing to be a beacon in the darkness because he believed in something he could not see but could feel in his bones. Vreth began to type. I came to the Crucible expecting to observe a competition. Instead, I witnessed the reason an entire galaxy speaks the name of humanity with awe. They are not the strongest species I have encountered. They are not the most intelligent. They are not the most technologically advanced. But they possess something that no other civilization I have studied in 40 cycles of service has been able to replicate. An unbreakable loyalty that is not born from shared biology or programmed command structures, but from individual choice. Every human on that field chose to stand beside the person next to them. Every one of them chose to suffer rather than abandon their duty. Every one of them chose to give what they had, even when they had nothing left, because someone nearby needed it more than they did. This is what makes humanity dangerous. This is what makes them beautiful. They are, without question, the most human species in the galaxy. And that, I now understand, is the most extraordinary and terrifying thing a species can be. Vreth submitted the report. He closed the file, stood up from his desk, and walked to his viewport. Outside, the human transport ship was preparing for departure. He watched it disengage from the docking ring, maneuver clear of the station, and pause for a moment against the backdrop of stars, small and gray and unremarkable. Then it leaped into hyperspace and was gone. A brief flash of light that left the darkness behind it, feeling somehow emptier than before. Vreth stood at the viewport for a long time. 40 cycles of diplomatic service had taught him to observe, to analyze, to report, and to remain detached. He had prided himself on that detachment. It was the foundation of good Shile practice. To see clearly, one must feel nothing. But standing there, watching the empty space where the human ship had been, Counselor Vreth Domai of the Shile Dominion felt something that no amount of training had prepared him for. It was not admiration, though admiration was part of it. It was not fear, though a healthy measure of that was mixed in too. It was something warmer and more unsettling, something that made his old chitin feel too tight, and his careful detachment feel like a cage instead of a tool. For the first time in 40 cycles, Vreth Domai felt inspired. He stayed at the viewport until the station's lights dimmed for the night cycle, and then he stayed a little longer. Somewhere out there, across the vast darkness between stars, 30 men and women in simple gray uniforms were heading home, carrying with them the same quiet, unstoppable force that had won the Crucible and shaken the foundations of a galaxy. They were just humans. That was the most remarkable part. They were just humans, and that was more than enough. The Valkyrie Interstellar Academy floated in the cold silence of space, locked in orbit around the neutral moon of Isara. It was a place built for peace. Dozens of alien species sent their brightest students here to study together, to learn about one another, and to build the kind of trust that might one day prevent wars. The hallways were wide and clean and filled with creatures of every shape and color. Some walked on 2 legs. Some walked on 6. Some did not walk at all, but floated on thin membranes of gas. The air recyclers worked overtime to maintain an atmosphere that would not kill anyone, and the gravity was set to a gentle standard that most species found comfortable. Most species. Cole Brannigan found it a little too light. He was used to Earth's pull, the heavy and constant drag of a world that did not care whether you were tired or hurt or ready to give up. Earth pulled you down regardless, and you either stood up or you stayed on the ground. Cole had spent 22 years standing up. He was from Austin, Texas, a city of heat and dust and music, and he carried that place with him, the way all humans carry their homes, not in their luggage, but somewhere behind their ribs. He was the only human at the academy, The Galactic Coalition had classified Earth as a Category 7 death world, which was their polite way of saying that the planet was trying to kill everything on it at all times, and that the species who survived there were by definition terrifying. Cole did not feel terrifying. He felt like a guy who was a long way from home, eating food that tasted strange and sleeping in a bed that was a little too soft. But the other students were afraid of him. He could see it in the way they moved when he entered a room. The Phalesi, small furry creatures with enormous dark eyes, would press themselves against the far wall. The Gorvathi, tall and thin, and made mostly of cartilage, would angle their bodies away from him, as if he might lunge at any moment. Nobody was cruel about it. Nobody said anything mean. They were simply afraid, the way a rabbit is afraid of a hawk, even when the hawk is just sitting on a fence post, doing nothing at all. Cole understood. He had read his own species file in the Coalition database during his first week. It described humans as persistent predators with extreme environmental adaptability, high pain tolerance, redundant biological systems, and a documented tendency toward pack bonding with non-human entities. It also noted that human saliva contained enzymes that were mildly toxic to 11 known species, and that the bacteria living on human skin could cause infections on worlds with less aggressive microbial ecosystems. Cole had to wear a mild biofilter patch on his neck at all times. He thought it looked like a nicotine patch, and this made him laugh, though nobody else understood the joke. His closest friend was a Tessavari named Lin Kuo. Tessavari were amphibians from a world of warm, shallow oceans and gentle tides. Lin Kuo had smooth blue-green skin, 4 slender arms, and large eyes that shifted color with her emotions. She was nervous about almost everything, but she was also deeply curious, and her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She had approached Cole during the first week of the semester, trembling visibly, and asked him if it was true that humans could run for entire days without stopping. Cole had said, "Well, not me personally. I get winded going upstairs, but yeah, some humans can do that." Lin Kuo had stared at him with her color-shifting eyes, cycling through shades of disbelief, and then asked if she could sit with him at lunch. They had been friends ever since. Their instructor for the semester's advanced course in interspecies threat assessment was Professor Dal Voron, a Kren. The Kren were insectoid, tall and angular, with compound eyes that saw in spectrums most species could not imagine. Voron had spent decades studying conflict between civilizations. He was precise, clinical, and deeply intelligent, and he had a particular academic interest in humans, though Cole was the first one he had ever met in person. Voron treated Cole with careful respect, the way a biologist might treat a creature he had only ever read about in journals. The class itself was fascinating. Students analyzed historical wars, studied failed negotiations between species, and ran simulated first contact scenarios where they had to decide in real time how to respond to unknown alien vessels. Cole enjoyed it. He participated calmly and offered perspectives that his classmates found unusual and sometimes unsettling. When a simulation presented a scenario in which a colony ship was under attack and all diplomatic channels had failed, most students froze. Cole leaned forward and started listing options with a steady voice, and Lin Kuo noticed that his hands were perfectly still. She asked him later how he stayed so calm during the crisis simulations. Cole thought about it for a moment and said, "I guess I've just seen a lot of disaster movies." Lin Kuo did not know what a movie was, and Cole spent the next hour explaining cinema to her, which she found both wonderful and horrifying. The weeks passed. The semester fell into a rhythm. Cole went to class, studied in the library, ate meals that he drowned in hot sauce he had smuggled from Earth, and slowly began to feel like maybe he belonged here. The other students were still cautious around him, but some of them had started nodding to him in the hallways, which felt like progress. Then one evening, as the artificial lights of the academy dimmed to simulate nightfall, Professor Voron sat alone in his office and opened a coded message from the Academy's administration. His compound eyes moved across the text. His mandibles, the heavy jaw-like structures on either side of his mouth, clicked together slowly. This was a sign of deep unease among the Kren, the equivalent of a human stomach dropping. The message informed him that a new transfer student would be joining his class the following week. The transfer had been approved at the highest levels of the Academy's governing board, pushed through by political pressure that Voron could smell even through the dry language of the official notice. Attached to the message was a sealed file bearing the sigil of the Najori Dominion, a militaristic empire that sat at the far edge of coalition space like a knife resting on the edge of a table. Voron opened the file. It contained very little information. A name, a species, a single word of classification that made his mandibles click again, harder this time. The word was operative. Voron sat in his dim office for a long time. He looked at the file. He thought about his class full of young students who had come here to learn about peace. He thought about Cole Brannigan, the human death-worlder who smiled too easily and made everyone around him nervous without trying. And now the Najori were sending an assassin to sit among them. Voron closed the file and stared at the dark wall of his office. The Academy had survived political crises before. It had survived funding cuts and diplomatic scandals, and one very unfortunate incident involving a miscalibrated gravity generator. But this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something that he could not predict. And Dal Voron did not like things he could not predict. He sent a brief reply to the administration, acknowledging receipt of the notice, and then he sat in the dark and worried.